My aim is never to discredit the West necessarily, but instead to add a context to show that multiple places around the world play crucial roles in what we have today, and that those things, even though they're written down and have constantly gone through revision over the thousands of years since writing, we see that, first of all, globalization has always been a thing, and that the majority of civilizations that were worth anything globalized. But for some reason, the Western world insists on the idea that they are unique to the world, despite the fact that their entire culture is based off of Western or Western Asia, from their religion, their structure, their farming, their trade, their most important trade partners. It doesn't matter to them that this is the case. Somehow there's something unique. Now, I must explain that this idea is not held anymore by most Western scholars, this idea that the West is unique to the world. It's actually held by a certain type of people. And the reason why it's not held anymore is because globalization through the internet has become obvious that it's the best way of making yourself rich, really, even as an individual. Any business you start, any idea you have, anything that you do will not truly reach its height without globalization. And so let's review this video to see exactly what they say. Now keep in mind, the things that this person will say will be incorrect in some ways and then correct in some ways. I do not agree with most of what he says, but that's not to say that there's no value in any type of thinking about the West.
Because it seems to me that whether you're in Japan or whether you're in Colombia or Africa, people are being globalized and westernized. They want to take that system and replicate it or clone it within their own countries.
Westernization is part of globalization. The countries like quote unquote Africa, Japan, China, Australia, all of these countries that are trying to westernize are not actually trying to westernize. They're trying to globalize, taking good ideas from everywhere. We can see this if we look back in our own history, even during the 1900s, we see that there was a cutoff. Remember, there was communism as an option, dictatorships, and there was also democracy. The democracy that they took, they didn't take because it was Western. They took after battles between different factions, some who wanted to install communism, some who wanted to install dictatorship, some who wanted to install, and there was battle after battle. The idea that everybody just saw the Western system and went, wow, what a beautiful system, we need to copy it. It's not true. If you look at Africa, they're partners, trade partners, and they're mimicking their ideas all over the world. And of course, not to mention the fact that the West, through actual writing, we have writing where I can literally show you from the 1800s, 1700s, 1600s, where they on purpose copy good ideas from all over the world.
Now, we know the origins are supposedly classical, Greek and
Now, I know the origin of the West is thought to be classical. It's thought to have originated somewhere in those areas, but this is why I emphasize the Islamic Golden Age, because most of the good ideas that came from the Renaissance or all of that, they all started with the Islamic Golden Age. Now, the Islamic Golden Age obviously did take from the classical, they did take from the Romans and the Greeks, but they also took from the ancient Egyptians, and the Romans and the Greeks also took from the ancient Egyptians. We even find ideas, for example, rods that are found inside of statues, which he's going to talk about bricks and statues and giant buildings as an important factor of the West, which I would agree. I actually would agree that buildings play one of the biggest role in our modern societies. But that doesn't mean that those buildings did not come from ancient Egypt or some other place, like the Western Asian people who moved into Europe.
Roman. In those terms, we have kind of a model of what Western civilization was at its origins. It was Athens and Rome, and then it was enriched by Judaism and Christianity through Jerusalem.
Of course, he's saying that they got enriched by this because, of course, that's the religion he prefers. But some people would argue that, some of the best days of Rome and Greece was prior to this, movement into Christianity, that they took themselves and they had the biggest empire and the biggest time before that. But Christianity is not even Western. Christianity is an Eastern religion. I mean, Judaism is damn near an African religion if you consider, the fact that it was owned, especially at that time, by ancient Egyptians, the time of its creation.
And that meant that roughly from around 700 BC, with the rise of the Greek city-state, to the end of the Roman Empire in the 5th century AD, we had about 1,200 years of a globalized Mediterranean culture that provided the legacy for what we enjoy today.
I have 2 points to say on this. One, it clearly provided some spine or something in the West. Obviously, there was some, when they went to look back in their history for something important to latch onto, I think Rome and Greece was clearly the strongest that they could have picked from in the quote unquote native Europeans. But there's a second point, which is the Islamic Empire really also took from the, that area, the Greek Roman area, but it had a completely different view of those ideas that came from that place. So the idea that, first of all, the Greeks and the Romans would approve of what we were doing if they kept strictly to their culture, I don't think so. I think everything that we're doing now is sort of independent of all of that. That a lot of people want to attach it to the olden days, but we can't even attach a lot of the things that we believe in today to 100 years ago. So to attach it to 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, it's not gonna work. And if you really think about it, think about the fact that the West had kings up until very recently. And then, of course, you go into democracy way later. And this was to throw away ideas that were previously held. And I've shown you how the Iroquois democracy played a role in that, and how even presidents, well, people who were establishing that democracy wrote about different republics that existed, and that even in Africa they've heard about republics.
We can define it in a variety of ways. Literary, it's Homer's Iliad and Odyssey around 700 and 650 BC, Hesiod's works and days, the great tragedians, Sophocles, Aeschylus, Euripides, the great historians, Thucydides and Herodotus, and this influence carries on to Rome, Virgil, Catullus, Livy, Tacitus, ending perhaps with St. Augustine.
See, here's the problem right here. It's always happens this way where, you can list off a bunch of people and say the works of the Western, Western literature today is due to these ancient people. But again, if you go and check, first of all, writing came from Egypt, the one that was used by those people. But if we leave that and we check writing today and we compare it to back then, it's vastly different. Vastly different. And a lot of nonsense, flowery language we had to throw away, because these guys used to even put flowery language in their official statements, which I think is a good thing, to drop that and stick to just factuals, actual factuals. But to me, what really matters is the fact that it's almost like the West has this insane thing where they want to attach their past too much to their present. And that's not going to work because we know, because of the works of the people living in the modern day. Now, obviously, the past affects the present, but because of the works of the people alive today, that's really why we have what we have. And abandoning the past, I mean, I think you should learn from the past and take all the good ideas, but you have to abandon the bad parts, which is usually 90% of it.
Philosophically, we know the pre-Socratics, Plato and Socrates, followed by Aristotle, the Epicureans, the Stoics, Neoplatonic thinkers that combined the classical legacy with Christianity. We can do it through religion, not just early Christianity, but a sophisticated Roman Catholic Church who uses philosophical tropes to explain faith and religion.
Now, in his opinion, he's given the full rundown of the best things of the Western civilizations, but I promise you that there are better things that you could probably point at in Western civilization than almost everything that he said. And he points at it in a vague way: philosophy. Everybody had philosophy. He points at it in a vague way and says religion. Everybody had religion. In fact, Christianity was everywhere. That was the point of Christianity.
All of that we know as modern Western civilization and the ancient origins of it. We can describe it, in other words. But where did it come from?
Now, here's the interesting part where he will talk about where it came from. Now, of course, he has to mention other civilizations because saying Western civilization came from Western civilization, it's kind of a not true thing. But I want to see if he's going to acknowledge it or he's going to acknowledge it and then debunk it. There's no way he can't acknowledge it because, of course, historically we know that everybody really came from Africa. But let's see how much of that he acknowledges and how much he discredits.
We can go on a treasure hunt, as it were, in two different ways: time and space. Let's take the latter first. Let's go through the Mediterranean and see if we can find it. We go to Egypt, and there's a colossal civilization from 3000 BC to around 700, 600 BC, and then it doesn't seem to have any influence. I'm not saying the Greeks didn't borrow from the Temple of Karnak for their early Doric architectural order, or I'm not saying the Egyptian eye doesn't appear in classical Greek art. I'm not saying that Koroi and Korai Greek statues look like this and they have an Egyptian frozen smile. They do, but not the core of Western civilization. There's nothing in Egypt that would explain constitutional government, free market economics, private property, the ability to explain natural phenomenon by reason and logic rather than faith and superstition, the triumph of the individual, a notion of personal freedom and liberty. All of the menu of ancient and modern Western civilization has no pedigree in Egypt.
Let's first answer his list before I talk to you about why his influence of the ancient Egyptians to Greece and Rome, he tries to give, and to be fair to him, a lot of people don't actually know how much influence Egypt had on, those civilizations. They're actually broken apart. If you look at linguists, they'll tell you, yes, they were influenced this way. If you look at archaeologists, they'll tell you they were influenced this way. If you look at certain people, but they never come together and put all that information in a circle and go, this is actually a deep influence rather than a small one that, you know, has no play in the Western world. But let's answer his list. The first thing I'm going to say is about his list is it's it's not true of the Western world for a long time. If we just start with just his list, let's start with constitutional government. Sure, I mean, to some degree, the ancients had a different government than that of other places around the world. Now, was it the only influence in that manner, in that sense? No. I mean, the Iroquois is a good example. But if you if you take the constitutional government point as an important factor, then Sure, the West sort of influenced that a lot. Now, are there other things that influenced constitutional thinking? Actually, he might even mention it because everybody knows this by the date of this video that it was made, Hammurabi and all that other stuff. But I'm sure he's going to discredit that as well. Now, free market economy. I don't even know what argument he has that ancient Egypt didn't have a free market. I actually have no idea. Owning private property, lots of people, men and women in ancient Egypt owned private property. Reason and logic, again, how do you disprove or prove that people had reason or logic in any other area? I mean, even if you go to the ancient Romans and Greeks who cared about writing down, it's quite obvious that they didn't care enough to get it accurate as much as we get it today. They were unreasonable in many ways and illogical in many ways, as we are today. And then if you go and look at other civilizations, you can find ways that where they were reasonable and logical that other places didn't have. Not to mention that there's atheists from the Islamic Golden Age who talked about reason and logic, saying that, you know, religion was just made up and nothing happened to them. And then obviously there was also, scientists, and I think the first person to ever write down the scientific, method, quote unquote, because I don't believe that you can really write down the scientific method. I don't believe there is a scientific method, to be honest. Was a Islamic scholar. Now, personal freedom and liberty, I don't think any Western country, up until maybe the modern world, could say that they cared about personal freedom. I mean, most of these places had slaves. But let's talk in general about what a beautiful system is. Well, we can see that ancient Egypt, the Sumerians, Native American cultures from the Aztec to the Iroquois to there was success without a lot of these things. He's putting these codes as some very important things, and maybe they're vital when it comes to success in some ways, but they're clearly not vital when it comes to success in all ways, because we see even more successful civilizations way before any of these civilizations existed, and they don't care about this. It's understandable to think what he's basically doing is he's taking things that exist now and he's saying, well, they must be the best. Not true. We have seen that you can get the same results through different methods.
Same token, it doesn't have any in the Fertile Crescent or in Anatolia. There are law codes, Hammurabi's law code, but it's a edict. It's not something that was adjudicated as in the Athenian assembly. So
This is what I'm talking about. In his opinion, if it's not argued about by quote unquote reasonable men, then it doesn't count. The laws of Hammurabi are a giant leap in taking care of human beings, and of course there's more. I mean, if you've ever read the Bible, if you've ever read some of the Sumerian texts that tell you about what people should do and how they should live and stuff like that, you will find things that are probably more important in understanding the value that these people had for each other. And of course, every civilization must value its citizens, otherwise, its citizens will leave. And we see spikes and we see drops in history when ideas would change. Guess what? The Constitution of the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, a lot of that stuff was not written, and it changed based on what the civilization needed.
we look around and we don't find places outside of Greece where the Western menu began. Well, how
One of the things that you can do to test if someone has copied your answers or copied your idea is to have wrong answers. And ancient Egypt had some wrong answers in the case of their medicine. A lot of their medicine was nonsense and would never work, but that was copied by the ancient Greeks verbatim. And because they copied it and put it in, and people like Galen, who were basically, you know, they were stealing from ancient Egyptian religion and ancient Egyptian medicine, all they did was carry that bad idea into the West, which lasted up until the 1900s. And then, of course, you have other ideas like writing, which they took from Egypt. You can see there's hundreds of videos on the internet on that idea, where, not idea, that fact that the Proto Sinaitic script invented the alphabet for the West. And so that's just two examples. I mean, I've got hundreds of examples of how Egypt played deep, deep cuts, even the bad ideas, deep cuts into the Western world. But if you get a list of 5 things that you know for a fact are very different in ancient Egypt, and then you claim that they're superior in some way for random reasons, then of course you're going to get the answer that you want. I'll actually put it another way. And once I say this, I want you guys to give me an answer in the chat. Would you rather have lived under Roman Egypt or Greek Egypt, or would you rather have lived under the native regime of Egypt? Now, I will have to say that Roman Egypt was pretty harsh. We see very little evidence of slavery in ancient Egypt. We see health, we see wealth, we see all kinds of things that were crumbled by the time that the Romans show up. Now, I'm not saying the Romans didn't add anything. Clearly, we see art starting to jump a level, but clearly there's something about their quote unquote life, their Western life, that's not as special as people like to think.
About by date then, because the Greek speakers were in the Balkans, southern Balkans, from about 700 BC onward. And our hunt can sort of focus on the first monumental civilization in Greece were the Mycenaeans. Remember, these are palatial cultures that built fantastic architecture. And if we look at these ruins today at Mycenae, I mean, my gosh, there's a 70-ton lintel over the monumental Lion Gate. We can go to the Palace of Nestor in Pylos, and we know that from about 1900 BC to their fall around 1200, there was a sophisticated civilization.
Which also borrowed from the life, art, culture of the ancient Egyptians.
They even had a record system, Linear B, a primitive form of writing.
You probably don't know this, but Linear B, of course, is a form of writing very early in Europe, and it seems to have had a jump earlier than a lot of other places. But it was too influenced by hieroglyphics. Evidence since we started checking, which was way back in the day, has shown that Linear B was definitely influenced by hieroglyphics the same way that almost any other was influenced. I don't know why there is a I don't know why he takes writing as a big thing when he's talking about a Western world, but he doesn't mention it when he was talking about, you know, the Mediterranean or whatever, when he's talking about outside of Europe proper and he starts talking about Egypt and talking about the Middle East. Why is he not mentioning the most powerful thing that ever was invented when it comes to history and dissemination of information, which is writing, which they took from elsewhere?
But the whole system collapses around 1150, 1175, 1200, whatever particular place we look at it, right around the time, a generation supposedly in the mythological tradition after the Trojan War. And what happens? There's sheer chaos. From 1150 to 800, we have the so-called Dark Ages of Greece.
But at the same time, there's another civilization thriving, even though it had more enemies than the Mycenaeans. It was apparent to all that there was a powerful civilization and they wanted their peace. But for thousands of years after the fall of the Mycenaeans and the fall of other civilizations around those regions, the ancient Egyptians continued strong as an ox. In fact, in my opinion, they still continue to this day, since most of their ideas we took.
That monumental civilization is lost. People become nomadic. They turn away from agriculture to sheep and cattle raising. There's a barter system. The know-how of knowing how to write in Linear B, writing Greek in Linear B, is lost. And that would mean that somebody in 900 BC could walk along the ruins of Mycenae, and he would see the Lion Gate, and he might fall into a Tholos tomb. He said, my gosh, these were supermen. These were people that had names like Ajax and Agamemnon. They were probably Mycenaeans. In other words, most of the Greek mythological tradition in the Dark Age was trying to make sense of monumental ruins in their very midst that they couldn't explain.
Okay.
It was completely abandoned. We don't know if it was because of climate, disease, natural phenomena, the so-called sea peoples, but this monumental civilization had vanished. And in its place, we had chaos, desolation. And when civilization returned to the Balkans, yes, it did concentrate in some of the Mycenaean centers at places like Athens and in the Peloponnese, but it was very different. It was completely antithetical to the Near Eastern model that had characterized Mycenaean civilization.
That's an important thing that he brings up, by the way. The Western world seems to have jumps every time a Eastern people moves into Europe. Like when farming came, there's a jump. When the civilizations of the Minoans, we find that there's Eastern people somewhere from the Sumerian regions. They sail all the way to Europe and land there, and there's even some evidence of North Africans moving into those regions, and the civilization jumps, it becomes better. Then, of course, ancient Egyptian influence, again, it gets better, but you don't see that much going the other way. You don't see the West influencing the others that heavily until you get to about this time, about 300 BC, you start to see some influence that is worth something. So you would think that that would make them think that there's something important to preserve outside of the Western cultures. This argument will never be made, of course. Now, was the civilization that came afterwards different? Yes. Did it have some shades from the Near East? Absolutely. Will he deny this? Of course.
We had about 1,000 to 1,500 Greek city-states.
Okay, but to be fair, so did the Sumerians, which had Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Nippur, Kish, Babylon, Akkad, Mari, Eridu, Lasar, Umma, and Aksha, which were ran by independent regional rulers on the behalf of the larger ones, and so did ancient Egypt. Now, I'm not taking anything away from ancient Greece. Obviously, they came up with unique ideas, but city states are not one of them. But there is the difference between how those city states were managed and other places around the world. Did the Sumerians have unique ideas when it came to city states? Absolutely. Did the ancient Egyptians? Absolutely. Was that part of the success of the Sumerians and the ancient Egyptians? Absolutely. So to me, this isn't a big point.
They had something called an agora, a place where people could come and freely communicate and freely barter and exchange goods. There was a
Keep in mind that he said something different happened in this location, and he hasn't mentioned anything that I can see that would be necessarily different than what happened in most other civilizations.
introduction of coinage. They
Introduction of coinage, huh? That's very unique.
took a Phoenician script and added vowels to it, and the Greek language now metamorphosized into what we know as today as Classical Greek, alpha, beta, gamma, mene, nede, theie, etc. That language was developed with the rise of the city-state.
In order to prove his point, he of course has to abandon the previous steps between the Phoenicians. As you can see here, hieroglyphics, Proto-Sinaitic, Phoenician, early Greek, Greek, and Latin. Now you could think, oh, this is something that was discovered in what, 2001, 2000? No. Flinders Petrie. We're talking about back in the 1900s when they found this information out. It's old. The West has known about this for a long, long time. But wait, if we've known this since back then, how come this information has never been set that high? Well, because, like I said in the beginning, there was a reason to sort of separate civilizations. There's this thing where if we find an African civilization, it cannot have foreigners within it. Otherwise, it's not an African civilization. And this was borrowed from the European mindset that in order to have a superior civilization, it has to be completely unique. When they couldn't find it to be unique, they have to cut off dates. The Phoenicians cut off. Well, where the hell did the Phoenicians get the alphabets from? You just keep pushing back until you get to the beginning.
Monumental temple buildings, Temple of Zeus at Olympia, and then the classical period characterized by the refinements on the Parthenon. All of this was sort of an intellectual, material, economic revolution, and it was...
Which, of course, he mentioned right in the beginning that the ancient Greek buildings were based, a lot of them, around things that were already discovered in ancient Egypt that were moved into those regions, both in their time and in the time of the Mycenaeans.
Again, antithetical to the palatial model that had come from the Near East and Egypt that had characterized prior civilization.
Of everything he listed, I'm not even arguing that they didn't come up with new ideas, but of everything he listed on this list, it was typical of civilizations in the Middle East and in Egypt. Nothing that he said is unique. I mean, writing, coinage, city states, buildings, all of these things are very normal. And not only that, there's a direct thing where Pythagoras is in where is he when he collects his information? All of these people, they all write that they a lot of the information of ancient Greece was gathered from. Come on now, we all know this information. So why is it being forced down this funnel?
In Greek. And it's very akin to our own. So that when we read Antigone and about the plight of a woman who is brilliant and has been oppressed by a male-dominated society, or we read Lysistrata about the folly of war and the anti-war movement, or we read Plato about whether it's better to be hurt or to hurt somebody. These are the same issues that we're struggling with today because we are Greeks.
Well, that's one way of looking at it. Or another way of looking at it is the reason why those stories match up is because they are the plight, or they are the folly, or they are the woes, the life and times of being a human being. And those concepts you just mentioned are universal. The oppression of women, the whatever stories about specific people, whatever you're talking about, these things are very universal.
Okay, so we've sort of solved our problem. We know that Western civilization, that is present America through the British Empire, through European civilization and the Enlightenment, the Reformation, the Renaissance, classical Roman imperial and republican tradition that goes back to Greece. We can go back to Greece and we can't go back any further.
This is laughable, trying to force this idea that modern Westerners are pure Greeks. This is actually one of the funniest things I've ever heard, because he listed himself things very important things that were taken from outside of those civilizations, saying that you can't go back any further, maybe in the smallest ways. There are stuff that stop and start with Greece. But again, the Western world was not characterized by those things, at least for a very long time. And when they finally adopted them, there were other civilizations in which they used as proof that those systems work. And we have documents written about this.
Further between 700 and 800 BC, there's nothing like it. And there's nothing like it anywhere, not Japan, not the Mayans, not the later Aztecs.
Again, just lifting up the civilization for no reason. And again, we have the Iroquois, we have so many other kingdoms, really, that have this same type of system. And in fact, tribally, a lot of systems operate like this. It's only when you sort of get this unification under one giant king that they sort of operate in this top down, I'm the ruler type of thing. But in almost all ways, the civilizations of the Greeks are the same as every other civilization that's ever existed.
Now we get to the central crux of the investigation today. Well, what caused it? I mean, the climate is the same as the Mycenaeans. They still are in the Mediterranean. Why all of a sudden, between 8 and 700 BC, do we have this explosion of something called a polis, a city-state? Well, to answer these questions, we've got to remember we're in the pre-industrial, pre-scientific world. And that means we're in the agricultural world. Today in America, we're eating 1 out of 100 people produces the food for us to survive one more day. That means 99 of us can make movies, we can drive, we can conduct open heart surgery, we can build a freeway. That was not true in the ancient world. It took 9 out of 10 people to produce food. So if you're going to look at changes in culture, you better look at agriculture. And lo and behold, when we go back to Greece between 800 and 700, we see a revolution, both a social and a scientific one. Somewhere around 8 to 700, people began to master the art of grafting, and that meant that they could take very fertile cultivars of fruit trees, we're talking everything from plums to olives, and graft them onto very durable species of olives that had roots. A wild olive is all root and no fruit, and a cultivated olive is all fruit and no root. So if you can combine the two, you can start to expand the area where these species can be grown, and they're much more productive. At the same
Yep, sure. Whatever he's rambling about, I actually have no idea now what the hell he's talking about. But whatever he's rambling about, he actually gives the real answers on the images. The wheel that came from the east, the cart, the horse. So every civilization at this point started to jump again because, of course, there was new technologies that were invented in the east and in the southern parts, which played a crucial role in what would happen later and how many people they would need to provide anything. Mixing of plants together to make new plants, that's old. That's old. That predates civilization.
same time, scientific agronomy started to investigate in everything from manures to putting lime on vines to stop birds from eating the crop, to understanding what was the precise dates to plant. It wasn't just empirical, it was theoretical and abstract, scientific, so to speak. And people started to gain the knowledge and how to master the Mediterranean triad of grapes, olive trees, and barley and wheat.
Wow, the science of growing food. I wonder if any other civilization around the world ever thought about fertilizer or, growing food in mass or feeding large populations or making sure that there's all kinds of things that people could do. I wonder if there's anywhere else in the world besides literally everywhere else in the world.
What was it about these three species that the early Greeks mastered and allowed them to create a sophisticated society like no other in their past?
Not much that wasn't discovered elsewhere.
Think about it for a minute. If you are out on a 10-acre plot of ground and you have to feed your family, what is it about these three crops? Well, wheat and barley, which ripen in the Mediterranean world from May to June, provide you with bread, the bread of life, a staple, carbohydrates. You can make a gruel, a soup out of barley, and so you have a stock staple food.
Now, of course, the interesting thing about wheat and barley is that they existed in 8000 BC that were tended to by human beings in the Middle East, especially the Sumerian civilization, which utilized this more than anybody else. Nothing unique about it at all in Greece. In prehistoric Africa, a staple food which played the same role that wheat plays in the Middle East, which of course the Middle East had that. One theory that I've heard by people is that the big difference between an African civilization and a Middle Eastern civilization is that African civilizations are more this based, while the Middle Eastern ones are more baking based. So one is more cooking based, like Africa, and then one is more baking based, like the Middle Eastern civilizations, with things like bread and stuff like that. I'm not saying there was no bread in Africa. There definitely was. You can make bread out of these things, and they did. But if you take that theory and then you apply it to here, and of course, sorghum, this corn, was traded to the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans from Africa as well. But if you take this into account, there's nothing special about what he's saying.
That you can have a 10-acre farm, you can have 8 acres that you can plant to barley and wheat. And with scientific progression, you can get sophisticated species that are more productive than earlier species.
I suspect that if he knew the history of sorghum or really any other native African species of food that were scientifically engineered to become what they were, I suspect that he would discredit it like he has so much of the other information in this thing.
Second, you can plant grapes.
Yep, he's correct. You can plant grapes, like the ancient Egyptians, the Sumerians, and so many others who also did that.
Now, what was so good about grapes? Well, think about it for a second. It gives you a non-perishable beverage through wine. If you have a staple grape crop, you have wine. You also have fresh grapes for 2 months out of the year, and you can dry them into raisins. And suddenly the parameters are starting to expand. An autonomous farmstead now has bread, barley soup, they have wine, they have some dried raisins, and they have fresh grapes in the summer. And we
Sounds like a great meal. Grapes, gruel, bread, and raisins. And of course, wine to top it off, because why not? Maybe, you might want to add a couple things to that, like maybe fish, milk, meat, uh, perhaps other plants, that they exported from outside of their civilization so that they, spices, you know what I mean? Things that will make your food taste better. I don't know.
add now olive oil to the combination. What's so good about olive oil? Well, it provides almost everything else you need to get along in life. When you crush olives and you make them into oil, you have a very healthy cooking fuel. You have oil for your lamps. You have grease for your axle. And once this triad started to be refined, people found they could be autonomous, average people.
Okay, but olive oil was available in ancient Egypt. It was available in the Sumerian regions. It was really available just about everywhere. And the places that didn't have olive oil had palm oil. In Africa, they didn't really care about olive oil, and people did try to trade it, but it wasn't going to work because, of course, what they had for fire, what they had for oil, cooking oils, what they had for all of that stuff was palm oil, a substance that is actually still used today in a lot of shops because it's so easy to mass produce as they did in Africa.
There's other advantages to the triad. Think about where they grow. You need flat terrace ground if it's on a hillside, nitrogen-rich soils for wheat and barley, but not for grapes. Some of the best wine is stressed. By that I mean it's on thinner soils and at higher elevations. And olives will grow almost everywhere in the world up to 2,500 feet. What this meant is if you look at Greece today, about 40% of it is flat land. Another 20 to 30% is rich land, but it's rugged and had not been farmed before. But as population started to increase, Greeks found that they could go terrace land and they could make vertical farms, so to speak. They
Well, aren't they lucky that they had flat land? But what's this got to do with anything?
could have wheat and barley, grapes a little higher, maybe 200 feet higher than olives on the crest, each of them complementary in the diet, and each of them complementary as far as their requirements for soils. But there were other complements and symbiosis that we don't even appreciate today. Think about what you have to do to consume olive oil or consume wine or consume bread. You can't eat barley, you can't eat an olive triad, it's very bitter, and you can't just take a grape and smash it and drink a glass of red wine. They all have to be refined. In the case of barley and wheat, they have to be threshed and milled. In the case of grapes, they have to be pressed and fermented. In the case of olive oil, they have to be cured and pressed into oil. And that meant on these small farms, people traditionally would have a threshing floor, they'd have a grape press, they'd have an olive press. In other words, when they grew things that the city and the people had disconnected from agriculture did not have, they did not just sell a raw product, the proverbial method of exploitation and oppression in every society. They had control of a finished product. They had a second stage in the food process, so to speak. And now we're starting to see how this synergy began. People found that they could take land that other people had not discovered that would be quite adequate for grapes, olives, and grains. And I could call this internal colonization, if you will. They discovered that it was rich in the diet and complementary in the diet, and it had to be refined, and they could control it. There were a couple of other key elements to the triad, and one was
Why don't you try to stick to the topic, buddy? Even though I'm telling, you know, it's fascinating. Yes, grapes are pretty awesome. All of this stuff is pretty awesome. It's just not unique to Greece.
labor. We're talking now about a family of 5, maybe with the addition of a slave, maybe not. But notice the harvest dates. May and June for grain, June and July for grapes in the Mediterranean, September, October, November for olives. There's not a press to do everything at once, and it's a very economical method of dispersing labor throughout the agricultural year. There's one final component to this complex paradox, and that is they're diversified. If you're specialized, you can master one thing. You can be the greatest grain grower in the world, and you might know more about grain than any other farmer, but you are very vulnerable. If you have a hailstorm in June, you can lose your grain crop. You may be the greatest viticulturist in the world, but if you get a frost in March and destroys the bud, you have no crop. And what we see with diversification of these 3 crops is the farmer still had access to different crops if he were to lose one. So a rain, a flood, an insect infestation, depending on where it happened and when it happened, it did not wipe him out completely. In other words, he was autonomous. He was independent. We're trying to find out why and where Western civilization develops. We have to look at agriculture. We have to look at the Balkans. We know that much. And we see a revolution between 800 and 500.
Well, back to the regular schedule. So, what do you have to say about the actual topic and not going off on some rant about grapes?
In which agricultural production becomes much more efficient, much more flexible, much more diverse, and it becomes empowering. Now, that's the key word, empowering socially, economically, politically, and militarily. Who were these people who began to discover the advantages of diversified agriculture? Well, we see them in the historical record. They can be an echo in Aristotle's Politics. They can appear on inscriptions. And politically, they want to protect their own property. They went out of the Dark Ages, they went out and fabricated a system. They have property, they want to pass it on, especially if you plant olives and vines. If you're 70 years old, why plant an olive orchard? Only for 2 reasons. You have children, and you can protect that property without a king, a Persian grandee, an Egyptian monarch or theocrat saying that they own all the land, or a Mycenaean lord that says you have to bring it up to the palace. No, it's yours, but you have to form a constitution. So
technically, the land belonged to the king, but in real life, you know, most of the time, most of the place, these things belonged to the individuals who purchased them, in which, there could be a levy of taxes and all kinds of things. This is normal, even for our day. But this has nothing to do with whatever. And of course, sure, they had a constitution that was somewhat different than any other place in history. I'll give you that they had something a little different. Now, was it in writing? Show me if it's in writing. And then secondly, don't dismiss the other places in the world that have it in writing and they actually stuck to the letter of their writings about how their system would be governed, which means that it might not be the most fair, but it's fair enough where you start off with a set number of rules that you know the consequences of your actions.
we start to see constitutions form for one reason originally. Ancient lawgivers are worried about the protection of property. Not individual freedom at first, but property. I own this, I developed it, I want to pass it on to my children.
Something that you might not understand is even though the property in ancient Egypt was owned by the pharaoh, it still was owned by the individual, and we see multiple generations of it being passed down from father to son or mother to son, whoever owns the property.
And out of that, all of these disputes, do I have a water right to this creek? Can he trespass through my garden? All of these issues then were started to be adjudicated through a consensual process. And the early constitutions of the city-states, and we have some of them, about 50% of the people could participate who own property. We can call it oligarchy, we can call it moderate democracy. The ancients called it politics, politeia.
Which was unique maybe in the Western world, but not necessarily in the far Western world. In the Americas, republics were pretty common.
It meant that there became a consensual process to harmonize all of these individual agendas. There was not a pyramidal society, which brings us to the element of sociology. One of the problems with Mycenaean or Egyptian or Hittite or Assyrian civilization or Persian civilization is you have a pyramid, a grand elite on top and a poor working or serf class on the bottom. There is no.
And as we all know, if we look around the democracies that existed back then or today, if we look at democracies, the people at the top, it's not a pyramid, right? It's a square where the people at the top are the same number or a very similar number to the people at the bottom. Or is it still a pyramid no matter what you apply? Because the people at the top, the one percenters, are always going to have way more than the people at the bottom who are going to have to feed off the hand. If we look at democracies around the world, obviously, you know, it's obvious that democracy or not, this happens.
No middle property owning citizen. There's no words in those vocabularies for it.
Of course, he's right. There's no official word for, wait a minute, there is. The word for property in ancient Egyptian is ta-nasetu. And of course, this word refers to several things, but one of them is the property officials who administer property. A second word is nahab, which is used when we're talking about giving property, assigning property to someone. And of course, it refers to, you know, to open. A third word that is related to property has to do with inheritance, to give property to.
Lo and behold, in the Greek vocabulary, we see the word polites, a citizen. He's not just a farmer, but he's a citizen. That means that he has certain rights and responsibilities to the state. The state is not somebody else's, it's his. If we were to look at an aerial view of Greece at this time, we start to see checkerboards. We can see it through aerial surveillance, we can see it through archaeological field work, we can see it in a variety of literary passages. And just as each man has one spot in the countryside, so he has the same corresponding spot in the council hall, the ecclesia. I vote and I'm equal to someone else just like
I don't fully agree with him on the equality thing. It seemed like after you get through the nobles in ancient Egypt, you start to see an equality of people once you get rid of the most high, which I think would be the same in some of those places. But I will give it to him that obviously ancient Greece developed democracy in some way. And of course, it's not the only place in Europe. The Vikings or the Scandinavian regions, the Germanic regions had democracy. Not to mention, which goes back further than Greece, by the way. And I keep mentioning that the Native Americans had multiple republics.
I'm an independent farmer. So politically, this agrarian system, and this is the beginning of agrarian and the romance of whom? The small, middle farmer, the working man of the soil, so to speak, all the way from Hesiod to Thomas Jefferson, the bulwark of Western civilization.
I promise you that civilization that operated on agrarian lifestyle goes back thousands of years before that very moment. And almost everything you highlighted about the uniqueness about the agrarian life is not unique. And there are probably better things that the Westerners did for some of these places than that. I mean, if we take paper, for example, they took papyrus, which was made in Egypt and was mass produced in Egypt, and they basically 10x'd it or 100x'd it so that reading and writing would be commonplace.
Economically, remember what we're talking about. We don't have a serf class who's taking their wheat and taking their grapes and taking their olives and being whipped in as they go into a central redistribution point with a Mycenaean lord clicking on his linear B tablet what you bring and what the government owes, and then giving you a little pittance back.
Instead of that, they have a slave class, one which they would stay with them up until the 1800s.
Instead, we have people who are threshing their grain, and they're coming to town with their own property, threshed grain, and they are bringing wine into town, and they're bringing olive oil, and they're saying you're going to buy it on a competitive basis. And out of that economic viability comes two very important concepts in Western civilization: autonomia, autonomy, and autarkia, self-sufficient. The ancient Greek citizen of the city-state prized the idea that he was going to be self-sufficient politically and self-sufficient economically. There's one last key essential to the equation: the military, because after all, in the ancient world, and perhaps the modern as well, 2 out of every 3 years people were fighting. When these small city-states had disputes with another one, usually over borders, they created a militia. A militia, what they called hoplites, men who owned soil and could bear their own arms and could fortify armor. They massed together in a phalanx, a dense formation of lance or spear-bearing soldiers. They had certain rules of engagement. They collided, and then the dispute over a few acres here and there between two city-states was over, and the men went back and were able to farm. In other words, they had a monopoly on the means of violence. And this is with the entire creation of civic militarism by empowered middle class. Let me conclude. What we appreciate today as Western civilization came from somewhere. We know where it didn't come from. It didn't come from the North and South American continents. It didn't come from China. It didn't come from Egypt. It didn't even come from the Eastern Mediterranean. It came from Greece. But we know it did not come from Greece before 800 BC. We know it didn't come after 300 BC. It came in a critical period of the city-state. But that means something. It means, where do they get these ideas? The city-state's geography, the city-state's racial pool, it was no different than anywhere else. Greeks were not inherently smarter than Africans or stupider than Africans. The climate was not better in Greece than it was in Malta, for example. What happened was that for a variety of reasons, the collapse of civilizations on the Mycenaeans, the Dark Ages, people were left on their own. They began to develop a Mediterranean triad. They began to create agricultural surpluses. The population began to thrive. They had a method of conflict resolution that was quick and logical. They had political representation. They had outlets for individual expression and economic activity. And
something he said in the beginning, which I find very interesting, is that 90% of the stuff that he's talking about exists in this civilization prior to the entrance of Christianity. And I haven't seen him use Christianity in this, even though it was part of his opening. So I wonder if he's ever gonna try and say, if this land was so perfect, what did Christianity exactly add to the civilization, morally and politically?
Originated with the idea of the small family farmer, flourished and came into its own through city-states, where more and more people were able to break out from the farm. They weren't dependent on the drudgery of farming, because farming itself was so efficient and was creating bounties and surpluses. I'll leave us with a final paradox, and that is, if that's what we know were the creators, those forces were the creators of Western civilization, what made Western civilization crack up?
Well, it's not a real paradox because it wasn't the best civilization necessarily, and it cracked up because it ran into a far superior civilization.
At the end of the Roman Empire, or maybe even today. It would have to be something like the opposite, that you have a system where people are not.
Well, first of all, in order for Western civilization to fall, it doesn't have to be opposite in any way, shape, or form. It can be slightly different and still be the crushing of Western civilization as it did happen in real life with the Islamic Golden Age.
Productive. They don't feel they have a stake in their own economic future. They don't have political representation. They don't have control over their own military. They don't have a freedom to say and do what they want and experiment scientifically.
You know, in conclusion, it shocks me how the Western idea of how the world worked, which I was taught too, it shocks me how different it is from real life and how anybody else perceived it in history. This idea that, science and free thought and all of that is purely Western, and everywhere else it was poor, scientifically illiterate, that they didn't know how to handle food and all this other stuff. It surprises me how piss poor or how the misunderstandings of other civilizations have led some scholars to not realize how deeply biased they are about their understanding.